morning. Right there. My name is Amanda Soa, and I am a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for contemporary issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous people that lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clarke Forum, the Office of Admissions, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Radically Reimagining Admissions for Racial Equity. As college education becomes a necessary stepping stool for most occupations, discussions as to who has access into higher education still rages on. The number of minority students on campuses are steadily increasing, and statistics reveal that women are more likely to attend colleges than their historically male counterparts. Additionally, there are efforts and recommendations being made to make college applications more accessible for minority high school students. Examples are scholarship programs like Questbridge and Posse, which target high-achieving students whose background can make the college admissions process more challenging. There are also nonprofit organizations that provide supplemental help to students from under-resourced high schools. A more popular incentive, especially during the pandemic, is to make college admissions test optional, an approach Dickinson adopted in 1994, years earlier than most schools. Colleges and universities now place more emphasis on students' community activities, familiar responsibilities, leadership roles, and other factors that testing does not account for. While these changes help campuses become more diverse, the 2019 college admissions scandal involving fake athletic scholarships has reignited the conversation about how legacy status, wealth, and privilege affect the admissions process. Students who are disadvantaged by these conditions stand in stark contrast to, for example, first-generation students from low-income areas who manage to enter higher education through their own efforts. So while college enrollments have increased overall, systemic historical barriers remain for many students of color. My junior and senior years of high school were supposed to be the most laid-back time of my high school career. I had passed the required New York State region exams, and college admission was not a huge concern. I knew I was going to attend one of the numerous state or city schools. Additionally, they were cheaper, the application fee was waived, and the process was easy. Dickinson slipped onto my list when I joined a nonprofit organization that guided high school track athletes through the college process. The organization, the Army College Prep, helped me understand the importance of SAT scores and how sorely behind I was in the application process. They introduced me to a wider range of schools, improved my SAT score, and helped me navigate the financial aid system. I share this not to discount the value of state schools, but to highlight the importance of exploring all my available options. Our speaker this evening, Marie Bigham, works with colleges and universities to make the admissions process available to students like me. Marie Bigham is the founder and director of admissions community Cultivating Equity and Peace Today, also known as ACCEPT. ACCEPT is an advocacy group that centers racial justice in the college admissions process and profession. In 2018, ACCEPT received the Excellence in Education Award from the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. Bigham is also the co-host of Hack the Gates, a research partnership focused on creating more equitable pathways to post-secondary education. Her work in college admissions began when she became the Associate Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Washington University, St. Louis. Since then, she has served on the board of directors for the National Association for College Admission Counseling, as vice chair and director of communications for the Association of College Counselors in Independent Schools, and on the board of directors of the Texas Association of College Admissions Counseling. She has also worked as an associate director in secondary education for numerous schools. Recently, she was named by Facebook as a global game changer for her vision, commitment, and desire to have racial equity in college admissions and creating more equitable pathways to post-secondary education. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clarke Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please note that the handicap-accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now please join me in welcoming Marie Bigham.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you to Dr. Aldrich. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to everybody in the Clarke Center for the invitation and for your incredible hospitality, and to this community, too. It's been really cool to see students again. That's so unusual for me. And I have to also acknowledge, I've only left Orleans Parish of New Orleans 3 times in the last 2 years. Once was in July for a family visit. Once was a couple months ago to evacuate during a hurricane, and now here. So thank you. This is great. I would much rather do this than evacuate. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, because I think identity and the lens that someone sees their life through is important in talking about the priorities in their lives. So Marie Bigham, and I'm the founder and executive director of Accept. Tonight, I'm going to talk about Hack the Gates, Radically Reimagine Admissions, the research to practice project that we did, oh my gosh, almost 2 years ago now. But who am I personally? I'm a multiracial Asian woman, Vietnamese and white. I have lived my life with this lens of understanding what it is to have privilege and what it is to not have privilege at the same time. A dear friend who is indigenous describes it as feet in 2 canoes and the constant battle of figuring that out. I am so Gen X. I am as Gen X could be. But what that means, too, is that I was born only 5 years after the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court decision, which made my parents' marriage legal and subsequently my being okay, according to the law. I've lived all over the United States, but New Orleans is my home now. It's the ancestral unceded territorial home as well of the Chitimacha, Homa, and Choctaw peoples. Folks have asked me, oh, how's New Orleans doing after this hurricane? We're fine in New Orleans, but if you want to support the Gulf South, it's supporting the Homa Nation and the Chitimacha Nation, which is still really, both are struggling desperately. I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 1995, and this will be the first of many detours in this talk. I just have to acknowledge this moment, this exciting and bizarre real life comes full circle moment. So I was preparing for this and watching previous speakers, and a few weeks ago, you had Mark Rank from Washington U. I think his co-author, Lawrence Eppard, was here speaking, and Professor Rank was on screen. And he was one of the 2 most influential professors I had as a student at WashU. He taught this class called Wealth, Class, and Inequality, and took us on this bus ride through the city to see the dramatic difference. But that was 1993, and to see him have this conversation, I was taking notes furiously, and it felt like I was right back in class. But that is to say that some of this talk is going to sound a lot like his and Dr. Eppard's. I'm going to talk about some mythology that really, I think, has a destructive impact on the path to college, and this mythology that blames the individual and puts responsibility on the individual while ignoring the system that is really causing the problems, and, also racism. So some of those themes that he brought up, I'm going to talk about tonight, too. So back to timeline. So after graduating from Washington U, I worked in corporate America for a little bit, returned to the university to work in admissions when I was there for 7 years, and college counselor and all those cool boards and things that I got to do. Like many women of color, I was told over and over again, you fight until you get that seat at the table, you push, you climb that ladder, and I did. I did in all the ways that my profession tells me to do so, right? I was on national boards, I was speaking all over the place. I had the privilege of writing 8 columns for the New York Times about college admissions. And yet, I still felt in those spaces unseen and unheard because I felt like the priority that I had, again, racial justice in this process, wasn't a priority otherwise. And that was really challenging and difficult for me. So, what did I do? Like everyone else, I went to Facebook, started a group. So in 2016, started this Facebook group called Accept. I hope salty language is okay for 1 second. I started this in the middle of the night in a fit of anger like so many people do. There was yet another murder by police of a black man, and I didn't know what to do, so started this group, and originally it was called Admissions People Sick of This Shit, but that does not look cute on a wristband, so we changed our name pretty quickly. I thought this was going to be a group of like 15 to 20 friends. We could come together and talk about action when we were sick of the world. We are now almost at 7,000 members on the Facebook group. We have almost 15,000 supporters across all of our platforms. So it's grown. It grew in this way that I truly had no idea would grow. And you can't manage something like that and manage college admissions for teenagers at the same time. So in 2019, I left my 20-plus year career in admissions to launch Accept full-time. One of the real privileges that doing so gave me that I wish we could figure out how to do. College admissions, by the way, is this relentless grind. It does not follow a 12-month calendar. College admissions as a professional follows an 18 to 2-year cycle. You can never catch up. You're constantly doing. And so the privilege that I had of stopping to think, to read, to dive into research, to dive into policy, had a dramatic impact on the trajectory of Accept. We expanded this idea of who works in college admissions. In college admissions, we tend to think of 2 players, admissions representatives, folks who work in high schools, and we even talk about that as a side. You work in this side, I work in this side. What that does not acknowledge is the billions of dollars, the industry that has popped up around this process, that there are so many other players, including policymakers, researchers, legislators, so many people involved with it that we expanded within Accept our vision of who is a player in this game. And by doing that, we were able to shift our focus, not away from, but to include, not just how we get individuals to buy into the idea of racial justice and equity in admissions, but how can we make systemic change then through public policy and advocacy, through collaboration and through research to practice. I come from a long line of academics in my life. My not having a PhD is a constant conversation in our family dinners. But I had a real respect for the work that's being done by researchers and why wasn't that translating? And so that became a real focus for what we wanted to do with Accept. Our first big project was called Hack the Gates, Radically Reimagine Admissions. I want to take, though, a slight detour, again, before talking about that. There is some mythology, like I mentioned, that I think that we culturally buy into so deeply, not just in the profession, but every person that we envision as this is that path to college. It's really hard to break that, and I think it's really hard for us to even engage in a conversation of reform when we're focused on this mythology. So some myths that I want to just put front and center that I'm trying to crack. First myth, the applicant is at the center of the admissions process. They're not. Applicants take the responsibility, right? Like, your grades have to be good. You better have these test scores. What about your extracurriculars? But the truth of the matter is the person, the thing at the center of this process is the institution. We call it, in the world of admissions, institutional priorities. So when a student is in the process, they might be in it, but they're not the focus of it. And yet, everything in the system is set up to believe that. Second, we have this vision, and you can see it in every TV show or movie ever touch college admissions. There's this admissions committee of people, and they read your applications, and they vote on the best student we can, and that's who gets in. Decisions about who gets in happen far before an applicant even applies. And by that I mean, there are very expensive consulting firms that build statistical models that get to institutional priorities. At almost any university, there are always going to be 2 priorities at the top of that list. First is budget. You've got to have as much money as you can coming from students. And second is yield. Yield, by the way, is what makes colleges look prestigious. Yield is the number of students who say yes to your offer. Colleges want to have as low as possible admit rate. You want to look as hard as you can to get in, and so desirable that everyone says yes. So these statistic models are built to make those decisions, to predict who is going to say yes and cost the least. And so as an individual, your chances in terms of admissions are defined by what little block you fall into on a spreadsheet, well before they see a grade, a transcript, or anything. And the last myth I want to pop is this idea of holistic admissions. And I hesitate to pop this one because in the space of college admissions and access, we hold up holistic admissions. We look at the whole student, not just your numbers, as the ideal. It is the best. And we hold on to that so deeply that it is the core argument in support of affirmative action as we fight this legal battle. I think that holistic admissions and how it has developed is one of the worst practices that we could have in this profession. The foundations of holistic admissions, those things, right? Recommendation letters, extracurricular activities, the things that aren't academic, those came to this process in the 1950s in large part because Ivy League colleges didn't want to admit Jewish and immigrant children. And so how do you do that? You don't include them. You say, they don't have the character. They're not people like us. And so my concern as we think about reforming this process is when the foundation is so rotten, when the foundation is built on such ugly things, is there any way to make that better? One other point to talk about that statistical modeling, because this one punched me in the gut. A couple of months ago, I think like many people, I got sucked into this TikTok thing about Alabama Rush. Thanks. Students, young women at University of Alabama going through the process of joining a sorority. And I'm watching these gazillions of videos and just kind of laughing. And then one young woman said, I'm going to tell you how we select people. And I'm listening to her describe the selection process and was horrified that it's almost identical to the statistical modeling that we use in college admissions. They want the young women who will make them look good, who can pay the fees, and who are going to say yes to them. So then I started to dig into this piece of software that sororities use, and oh my gosh, it was designed and founded by someone from the world of college admissions. So when you think about sorority life, that's what we do in admissions. So these are 3 myths. All right, now let's get back. So Accept did this big project, still kind of ongoing, called Hack the Gates. Let's radically reimagine admissions. And the words that we chose were very intentional. Hack the gates, the idea that gatekeeping is what we do in selective admissions. Here is, in some places, quite literally, this beautiful campus with this fence around it and a gate that you walk through. And the job of this profession is to decide who the door opens for or not, and what those barriers are in the path. By the way, if you're doing a project with the word hack in it and you send emails, servers don't like that word, and sometimes those emails don't get through. That was a tough one to learn. Chose the word radically really intentionally, and I'm going to talk about why, and I'm going to quote Dr. Rank. I'm going to send him this slide later, too. He brought up 2 points in his talk, or in his Q&A, that really punched me, again. First, if we only look at the individual, we will continue to have well-educated poor people. That, I think, very much speaks to how we approach reform in this process. But then second, and this might be my next tattoo. I love this one so much. Why do certain people lose, and why does the game produce losers in the first place? If higher education in this country, post-secondary education, which we know provides more opportunities, generational wealth, it is that path to the American dream, and I don't like that phrase, then why is the system set up so that people don't get to play? Why is that okay? And we're not going to be able to answer these questions until we do some really radical thinking, really different thinking, because the reforms that we've been approaching so far are really just at the margins. Oh, pardon, let me go back to this one. Second word was reimagine. So here's the thing. This process of applying to college, it might be old. Standardized testing's been with us for about 90 years, and like I said, those ideas about holistic admissions came to the process in the mid-50s. But it's not like Athena popping out of Zeus's forehead, right? Like, someone designed this thing in the first place. We can redesign it. And too often, those of us who engage in this professionally, and in large part because the time suck that makes it hard, you kind of shrug and say, this is what it is. The question isn't, why are we using recommendation letters, but how could we perhaps read them better? And I want us to get to the point of the why. Why the why? And then why admissions for racial equity? Education Trust put out a fantastic report at the beginning of 2020 that said essentially, when you have problems that have a racialized impact, you have to have racialized solutions. And too often in higher education, we pretend that solutions can be colorblind and get us to that place. And we have too many decades of history now to show that that is absolutely not true. And so if we're going to reform this thing and we acknowledge that it's racially biased and exclusionary and harmful for generations, then we have to have solutions that are specifically race-based. And even not the Supreme Court, but even the appellate courts just this week, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill said that was okay. That race is so integrally a part of a person's being that you cannot take that out. You can't unbake the cake. So some reasons why we chose this, but again, those fundamental ideas that informed how we wanted to do Hack the Gates. So Amanda mentioned the Varsity Blues story. Let's think about timeline. So the Varsity Blues story, which was, rich people behaving badly to buy their way into college, and here's my snarky comment, and colleges were mad about it because they didn't get the money, because we know that happens. The story breaks, everyone in my profession's talking about it, and I get a text message from a dear friend who is a researcher, Dr. Oyan Poon. So the day after the story breaks, she texted, there ever been a massive rethink of this process? I want to really think about this. I said, yeah, that's exactly what my husband and I are talking about. Sometimes you have those friends who you pitch an idea and you chat about it and it kind of disappears. And then you have some friends where something happens. Oyan is one of those friends where something happens, which is cool and kind of terrifying all at once as well. She led the charge. So this is March of 2019 that we're texting. By July, which is really moving fast in this world, we had this going on. Except in the RISE Center, of which at the time Dr. Poon was the leader, we were the co-hosts. We had funding from the Joyce Foundation, and we had partnership with Common App and Reach Higher, and oh my God, this thing is happening, you guys. We're gonna have to make this happen. Hack the Gates had 3 components to it. First, we built a community online, kind of using our accept model. Had a bunch of webinars. We wanted to have a convening conference, get everyone together. And at that convening, we wanted to have researchers there who are going to take these ideas and put them into policy papers. Take those ideas, turn them into practice by having good research to back those things up. This was a big undertaking, especially when you consider it was a party of 2 putting on this whole thing together from scratch. My dining room became a conference staging center. Hack the Gates, the convening, it was really fun. It was November of 2019. I want to talk about the intentionality of it, because one of the things we hear in academia all the time, and we hear it in admissions, we know there are people of color out there, we just can't find them. We did, and we did it, frankly, without a whole lot of work. So here's some of the stats about the folks who attended, but my favorite part of it was that when you walked into the room, we asked folks to make their own name tags, and we said, just your first name or any first name you want to go by today, we don't really care. But you can't use your title and you can't use your affiliation of your institution. And I got to tell you, in my space, that is killing people. Like, that was hurtful at times. And to watch people struggle without having the power structures they were so accustomed to that benefited them really helped our conversation. And we also had like a swear jar that if someone was overheard using either their title or their affiliation, they had to put $5 into it, so that was kind of fun too. But the researchers came out of this with some really cool options. Again, remember when academia says we don't know where those people of color are, here they are. This wasn't hard to do. 8 of the 10 people of color, 2 pre-PhD, 2 based outside of academia, only 2 had tenure at the time. We were really intentional. We wanted people of color early in their career, and we were also, as I like to say, athletic conference agnostic. I don't care what the fancy name was. It didn't matter. We wanted the right people there, and we got them. And so these folks came to the convening, and there we were in November and generating these really remarkable ideas, and the plan was we were going to have policy papers come out, In the spring of 2020, we were going to take that on the road, iterate it, come up with policy papers, and we know what happened. Not that. So we're going to take a little detour again. A big question that came up in the last couple of months was, wow, there's so much change in college admissions. So many exciting things. Did Hack the Gates impact this? Did Accept impact this? Or was it just the pandemic? The pandemic did cause some things, but my point, and I really think, is a lot of the changes that the pandemic forced in the higher education and in college admissions, I don't think they're going to stick, unfortunately. So a couple to chew on. One thing that changed was we moved some deadlines in admissions, and that gave me a lot of hope because, frankly, college people tell you, we can't move those deadlines. We can't do it, can't do it. So here we are in March of 20. This pandemic is happening. It is right at the moment that college admissions decisions were hitting the email boxes of seniors, and everybody in my profession was freaking out. And the first big advocacy piece that we did with Accept was to beg, plead, cajole colleges to change that deposit deadline. So those of you who did this recently, you might remember you're supposed to send college your decision on money by May 1st. And we said, with all this going on, is that really possible? Like, you might remember the economic convulsion that happened, and it was so hard. And to ask someone to make a decision about how they were going to spend maybe $300,000 in that moment, sight unseen, seemed grossly unfair. And that happened. Over 700 colleges that utilized that May 1 deadline did change. Some of them pushed it even as late as August. That was great. It didn't stick, though. There were under 10 colleges of those 700 who stuck with it this year. This quote, and I acknowledge I'm picking on Bill Conley, who is not far away from here. This is what I mean by institutional priorities. Bill said in the time, to have yet another decision pushed off just adds more anxiety. Maybe I'm rationalizing, because yes, it is in the best interest of universities to know this information. That was really surprising to me. I'm like, oh, you said the inside part out loud. We don't do that in this profession. So those deadlines, that remind me, these deadlines were set up for the purpose of the institution, not for the purpose of families. As Amanda mentioned, there was a lot of change in standardized testing that happened because of the pandemic, but it had been happening, and Dickinson should be extremely proud that they went test optional in 1994. That is the bleeding edge. They were one of the first folks out the door. There was this huge rush to test free, test optional. That has been sticking. West Coast publics, not a single public institution on the West Coast requires standardized testing now, which is pretty cool. And subject tests, some of you might remember, a College Board product, those are dead. A long time ago, I placed a $10,000 bet that those things would be dead by 2010, and I was really bummed that I lost that one so much later. But we know that it's not going to stick quite as much. Florida, as a state, for example, said no, we're sticking with testing. That also caused their application numbers in that state to drop by almost half. State of Georgia insisted after 1 year of being test optional, nope, we got out of that test back. Scholarship programs, major programs, some of them still ask for testing. But my hope is that state policies are far friendlier now to ignoring testing than they ever were, the South notwithstanding. Application review, record review, that changed too, somewhat. Oh, I skipped a slide. Recruitment. Things did change a lot with recruitment. It's really interesting. I'm curious in 3 years to see what's going to happen, because online life really just kind of shifted all last year, right? Everything that we used to do in person happened online. That was a dramatic change, but what wasn't a change was that the tactics didn't change, the messaging didn't really change, the priorities didn't change. Who got invited, who was recruited, that didn't change. What I'm curious about in 3 years is if colleges will go back to only in person. I want to learn about the efficacy of this online recruitment and the savings. The amount of money a university spends to send people on the road is enormous. This could be a big change. Like I mentioned, application review. This changed somewhat in that with testing disappeared, colleges had to scramble real fast. There was not really any guidance out there. What do you do? And I think there was a much different understanding. Unfortunately, it took this long. Of the real inequities in education. What didn't change? The parts of the process, the things that we cling to and say you must have. One of my big messages that did not succeed was in talking with admissions folks. saying, you know what, you want to help students right now? Ask only for what you absolutely need to make a decision. Like, what do you have to make a decision about a file? And that didn't change. Colleges just kept asking for the same stuff. But colleges seem much more open now, though, to interrogating what we ask students to do, the value of the hoops that we ask them to jump through. Some other things that popped up. No surprise, pandemic hurt more people who were marginalized. The most privileged felt it the least. If any of you are a fan of the show Succession, I thought it was fascinating that the showrunner said, oh no, the pandemic's not going to impact this new season because the pandemic doesn't impact billionaires the same way. That's really true. I think this showed us in college admissions that this tenuous social support system has really failed us right now. And there are so many students who are struggling in their education because life is complicated at home. And we understand this at this moment, but are we as higher ed going to remember this in 5 years, in 15 years? Because those kids who are in kindergarten right now are going to feel this ongoing impact on their education. Will we as a process remember that? Most disheartening is that we know that Black and brown students, low-income students, first-gen students are the ones most likely to drop out of the education system during the pandemic, that we've lost them in many ways. How do we find them? How do we bring them back into the system and support them as such? And how, again, will college admissions impact that? So, a year after Hack the Gates, I did an interview with the Chronicle of Higher Education, a follow-up. Like, oh, cool. Yeah. So how did Hack the Gates impact all these changes? And I was like, it really wasn't us, and that makes me really sad and mad at the same time. It wasn't messaging about racial equity. It wasn't messaging about including those who have been historically excluded. The changes that occurred were because of the pandemic, and they occurred because, in some ways, really altruistic reasons, but in many ways, institutionally focused reasons. I wish more had changed. I wish more stuck. But it didn't, and that happens. So Hack the Gates, back to that timeline. We pushed off the policy papers. People needed time to write, and I think that worked out really well for us, to be honest. The papers really took into account the impact of the moment in which we're still living. One of the papers we decided, by the way, you should check these out too. One of the papers we decided to rush forward a little bit faster. A paper by Dr. Dominique Baker, who's at SMU, and Akil Bello, who is with Fair Test, a standardized testing organization. They wrote a paper called In the Pandemic, Test Optional, Admissions is Necessary but Insufficient. And that was important because the conversation around testing, test optional, test free, has often focused on it being the single step you need. If you get rid of tests, everything will be equitable. It's not even close. There's so many other pieces of that puzzle that are still deeply inequitable. So we wanted to get this one out early and as fast as we could because we knew the questions were coming up a lot. The other 7 papers came out in August of 2020. So we have 8 papers, right? And usually what happens is researchers put out this great work and then it sits on a shelf and it just kind of sits there and it might make a couple of articles, but it sits there. And we were adamant, that was not going to happen this time. So of those 8 papers, 5 of them still have a lot of life and are still moving forward. Dr. Adrian Huerta, who's at USC, wrote this remarkable paper about redesigning college fairs. And it seems kind of like, oh, is that a thing? Like, so what, college fairs? Adrian pointed out that when he was a student, he had never once even heard the phrase college fairs, and he lives in South Central LA, and he had not once seen a sign or any advertisements at his children's school or anything about what a college fair might be. And so he asked his students in his neighborhood, do you know about college fairs? And they looked at him like, what are you talking about? If you went to Beverly Hills, that wouldn't be the conversation. And so he and I have received a nice piece of funding to continue that project, and we're about ready to start surveying students at alternative schools to ask them, how did you, if at all, receive any college information? And if you were to design a college fair, what would it look like for you? So that's a cool one. Another paper that is, again, getting a lot of legs and interest is from Dr. Poon, Dr. Oyan Poon. And the title of her paper is essentially College Admissions is like the Hunger Games. We might change that now to like a Squid Game. But her radical idea is, why don't we look to something like Match.com? Why don't we look to perhaps the medical match system for residency? Why does this process look this way? Let's really take this apart. So she just received a large piece of funding for that, and we're gonna keep digging into that one. Another paper that I'm thrilled has received a lot of attention is by Jennifer Delaney, who's at Penn, and University of Illinois, and Taylor Odie, who is a PhD candidate at Penn. They studied a process that the state of Idaho has implemented called direct admissions. So imagine you are, a high school senior, and at the very beginning of your senior year, you get a letter from the state higher ed board that says, congratulations, you are already been admitted to X number of our state universities. And by the way, not only have you been admitted without applying, but this ticket for admissions, it counts for 3 years. So if you need to take some time off, if you want to do whatever, here you go. And by the way, your financial aid package, that counts for 3 years as well. That paper has gotten so much interest that we've been able to talk to state legislators in 4 states now that are exploring that idea. I think that's a super cool one. There are some of the papers that aren't getting as much attention that I really wish they would. Dr. Aaron Corbett wrote a paper about students who are in prison who attend these very highly vaunted college in prison programs. And one of the things that she pointed out is that those processes mirror the processes for people who are not in prison. And I'm gonna pick on my alma mater right now. Washington U is very proud of its prison student program, but the process they use is, guess what, identical to if you're not in prison. So there you are, being asked to write an essay about your hardships in that moment. And by the way, the demographics of those programs also pretty much reflect not the prison population. They're gonna have mostly white people. They're not first generation. And I loved that she just poked a hole in that. But believe it or not, sometimes people don't think that someone is deserving of an education because of the justice system. That's deeply disappointing. But it's really cool that these papers are continuing to get funding and continuing to get ideas, and that people keep asking us about it, and that we can continue to chew on these ideas so that they will become good practice. Accept just received a large grant from Facebook. And I always hesitate to say this because, to be honest with you, we got this grant on the day of those terrible Senate hearings, and it's like, oh, thanks. But we received a nice grant from Facebook, and we're going to build a research practice library online where professionals can get access to all of this great research out there. But the goal is that our shift with this is you get access to the research and you get access to good practices that are tied to it. So we're very, very excited about providing that. And in one of the weirdest, most unexpected things I could ever say in my life, Dr. Ted Thornhill wrote a paper about communication equity audits as a way of helping admissions office behave in more equitable ways. And chewed on this idea for 6 months, and we figured out how to operationalize it, and we started an equity tech company. Never thought that was a thing. And so this paper that was an idea is now a tech company that we've signed contracts, and we're building this piece of software now. Who would have thought? Being able to step away from the profession to think has given me the privilege and the opportunity to do these things, but that's part of the problem. Those of us who work in the ecosystem of college admissions shouldn't be on this never-ending treadmill of never-ending work that makes it impossible to stop and think, that makes it impossible to say, how can we do this better? How can we put the students at the center of this? And so the president of Dickinson is listening. Y'all need to double the size of your admissions staff so people can breathe. You'll retain them more too. There's so many more conversations happening now about how you reform this thing, how you center racial equity in this thing, and that has been really one of the greatest privileges in my life, because I believe really thoroughly, and this was all over our stuff at Hack the Gates, we can't do this work separately. You can't have just people in the profession calling for reform. You can't have users. It has to be everyone who swims in this to make this change. And I invite and hope that all of you join in this change, in this fight for change too. If you want to learn more about Accept, follow us. Here's where you can find us online. And we'd love to have you engage more. I firmly believe that so much in our culture and our society could really be fixed if we just allowed ourselves to put aside that mythology of how this process works, acknowledged the truth of this work and those barriers, and actively started to remove them. I think we could do that. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me tonight. And by the way, as much as I appreciate the point about being kind and how you ask the questions, I love pushback. If I am full of it, tell me. Would love to hear that.
On that note, it is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Hey, so one of the things that I think you touched on a lot in there was how on the one side of things we have standardized testing and that whole sort of ecosystem and how that is very messed up and sort of inequitable. But on the other side, you mentioned something that I have not heard a lot of in the discussion around equity in college admissions, is that holistic admissions, which is sort of this cornerstone of the college admissions process right now, is also inequitable. Like, how do we find sort of a third option on that scale, and where do we go from there in making more equitable college admissions?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And it is, I have to acknowledge, it is a radical thing for me to stand up in public and say that I think there are real problems with holistic admissions. Again, so much of our profession, we've really hung our hat onto that. This is the best model. But I think as many of us are just being more critical and thinking about it, we're saying, oh, this isn't it. And to be honest, I don't really have an answer for you of what that other way should be. But I think the important thing is to acknowledge that this was designed, and it's working exactly as it was designed to work, right? If it was designed before, it can be redesigned. And so I don't want to look for the third way. I want to look for the fifth way. I want to look for the 10th way. I want to look for all of the ways that that match can be made, however that looks. But if we don't start poking and being open-minded to what that might look like, we're always going to be stuck right here. And nationally, like, we have to be more comfortable looking at how other institutions behave, how other nations behave with this. And some of it won't be fun and pretty. We really believe deeply in our rugged individualism here in the United States, and when you strip that away, people are really cranky about that. This is not going to be easy, but I think it's got to happen. So I don't have an answer for you except to say that we got to find more than the third. We got to find 3 through 20. Thank you for that.
What kind of issues do you see when tackling these problems with private and public institutions?
Ooh, that's a great question. So it's the issues with private versus public and institutions. And I'm going to take this from a couple of levels, not just post-secondary, but also secondary as well. I think there are enormous issues there. I mean, talk just the funding issues, that's an enormous disparity, the pricing models, and how colleges and the admissions process really obfuscate the actual cost that people pay. In the secondary level, the dramatic difference between private education services and services at public schools is so radically different. We talk a lot in our profession that there's so few college counselors based in high schools, right? There's this really terrible lack of services. In theory, and I don't agree with this necessarily, in theory, the good ratio of student to a counselor in a public school is 200 students to 1 counselor. In private schools, it is 50 to 1. Can you imagine the difference in service delivery if you have 50 kids to work with? And I say that the goal, the optimal, is 250 in a public school. I challenge you to research what the average is in Pennsylvania. And those of you in this room who attended public school, I bet you could probably say, wow, I had 2 counselors and there were 600 of us, 800 of us in my class. In the state of Louisiana, the average ratio of counselor to student in a public school is close to 600 to 1. As a private school college counselor in 4 states, I never had more than 45 students in my caseload at any single school. That disparity is enormous. One of my ideas, though, and I understand that this is an idea that will put me and a lot of my friends out of a job, I don't think that this process should be so complex that it requires a navigator, nor do I think this process should require a third person to speak for someone. College counselors are really important in this system that we've set up, but wouldn't it be better to have a system that didn't require that, right? So I think there are so many issues in the difference between public and private, but every step of education, not just in college, it's a tough one. That's a tough one to unknot. Next question. Another question.
How have companies such as College Board or the Common App responded to accepts policy ideas? Because I know these companies rely on the current college application system and standardized testing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to start by acknowledging first, I have been incredibly critical of College Board in very public ways. 5 years ago, I publicly called on the CEO of College Board to resign. Also, by the way, he makes $1.26 million a year running a nonprofit. College Board is also the second or third wealthiest nonprofit in the United States after the Catholic Church and the NFL. And before the pandemic, they had a couple $100 million in cash on hand. I think that's really sickening. I think it's really grotesque that in this country that we've let one organization decide not just testing, but in theory, curricular choices. Start by acknowledging that. And also acknowledging I've also been a really public supporter of Common Application to the point where one person accused me of being an unnamed PR person for them. And I was like, no, trust me, I'm not. So I've put that out there first. Common App is really one of the organizations right now that is leading the way in admissions reform. They truly are. They are having conversations to explore each part of this and equity. They've made a lot of pretty intense changes in the last couple of years that are very supportive of equity. And I'm always proud to be associated with them because they've really done a good work with that. College Board hasn't. They just haven't. And you know what? They're going to fight tooth and nail to hold on to their market share and the gazillions of dollars that they make a year. And even though testing as a pathway to college seems to be slipping away, what College Board has done beautifully is they have really excellent lobbyists, and they've made the SAT a requirement to graduate in something like 25 states, right? So they don't really care if colleges at this point are going to use tests or not, because when you have the majority of the country requiring high school students to take their test, those are contracts that are locked in. I'm going to strongly encourage all of you to look into the real issues with standardized testing in the SAT. And a dear friend of mine, a guy named Jay Rossner, who is based in Northern California, has done some of the best research about this. And again, kind of mind-blowing. One of the things that he talks about a lot that has gotten some traction but is shocking when you think about it. Those of you who took the SAT, you remember how there are some sections that they tell you this is a test, this is a practice, this doesn't count, we're trying out questions, right? There's always a section where they're testing out new questions. Jay's research demonstrates that those questions from those we're trying it out section are chosen to be on the real test, normed on the performance of white boys. So, if a question in that testing, the practice of it, if it's all, Asian girls who get it right, but not so much white boys, that's not going to be considered a good question. But if more white boys get it right and everyone else is bummed out about that when they're not getting it, that's going to end up on the test more likely. There's lots of little details like that about SAT that you should dig into.
Hello. You briefly mentioned sort of the move towards equity in gaining education for those incarcerated. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, exactly kind of I'm not sure if Accept is involved with it or you yourself, but if you know any sort of organizations that are moving towards trying to increase that accessibility to those in
For sure.
incarcerated.
If you're interested in that work, one of the first people I would start with is Erin Corbett, Dr. Erin Corbett. You can find her paper on our website, and she's really leading that in a research way. She's also someone who's not based at a university. She's executive director of an organization who has a PhD and does research, so another cool way that work's being done. And she works one-on-one with folks in this situation. There is also a strong movement right now, and it's in legislation, is Pell for prisoners. I think that has so many possibilities and so many cool opportunities. So if you want to get engaged with advocacy, check out Pell for Prisoners, because it's gaining movement, it's gaining traction. And I think especially with the broader awareness of the school to prison pipeline and what happens after someone who's been incarcerated returns, I think that broader awareness is doing quite a bit to help. One other move that we're strongly, and this is where I get more involved, is to really push colleges to no longer ask questions about criminal records or about discipline records. There's so much evidence that shows of the racial impact of those policies, but that also, in theory, if a college is asking about a discipline record or a criminal record, it's for the safety of the campus, but there's almost nothing out there that says that that works, right? Almost nothing. And we know that things happen on a college campus. So if criminal actions are occurring and there's this mechanism in theory to keep that out, why isn't that working? So I think those two things could be things. But I would check out Dr. Corbett's work, and I would check out Pell for Prisoners. They're doing good stuff. Thanks. These are great questions. I really do miss being with students. Oh my gosh, you guys might convince me to go work at a school again. I say that, but I'm probably not.
I just want to say thank you for coming. And my question is, earlier you mentioned how testing was not the only step that needed to be taken to make the college admissions process more equitable. And I wanted to know if there were other things that come to mind that you think should be modified or gotten rid of when it comes to the application specifically.
Sure. Thank you for that. So, we have the pathway of just tearing this whole thing down, burning it to the ground, and rebuilding it over here, and I want that to happen. But in the meantime, other work's got to happen too, and I think that's a good point. The first thing that I typically suggest to colleges when I'm working with them is to do a serious equity deep dive into each step of the process and practice. What are the messages that the college is sending with every single thing they're doing? How is that welcoming some? How is that excluding some? And I think that's the first place for an institution to start. For example, I mentioned this in the admissions office earlier. There is a highly selective and desirable Northeast private school that had an essay question 10 years ago. There was this, I'm going to use the word cheesy, there was this cheesy book. It's like a management book that was called Who Moved My Cheese? And it was one of those books that you're supposed to read in business school. And so this college asked their essay question framed around that. In the book, Who Moved My Cheese? Da, 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 da. If you were a cheese, what would you be and why? So I'm working with a young woman when I was in New York. She's from the Bronx. And she says to me, as we're looking at this question, she goes, I only know 2 types of cheeses, yellow and government, and I am pretty sure that is not the question they're asking. And that told her at that moment, they don't want me. They want someone who understands cheese. Those little barriers, those are real. And so I think one of the first things a college can do is to look at each step of their process and applications and say, what messages are we sending and what are we getting back, and is that really what we want to do? Here's a radical idea. I think colleges should quit asking for recommendation letters for equity. I think it's really problematic that we ask in this process for people to speak for themselves, but then we have this whole other separate process where we ask someone to speak on your behalf. And by the way, you don't get to see those letters. Recommendation letters are notoriously rife with biases, not just by the writer, but also by the reader as well. And what do they really say at the end of the day? Most people in the admission profession will tell you there's not a lot there. It's a hoop to jump through. But the damage that can be done is real. there was a colleague at a private school in New York City, and I happened to see one of her letters when I was in admissions, and she was talking about a black man who was applying to Washington U, and she used the phrase in there, and he knows which knife and fork to use at a dinner party. And I was like, how many dinner parties do you think we're having at Wash U? This is a thing. Like, I really did not understand it. And I asked her, I was curious, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, you know, it's important for colleges like the Ivies and for Washington U to know that he won't be an embarrassment for you. He knows how to behave. Talk about racist, like from top to bottom. But if someone who is not hyper-conscious and aware of that, how do they read that, right? Worse than that, what about the person who reads it and says, oh, good, they're the right fit for us? I think those things we could get rid of now, and it wouldn't impact the process one bit. I think those are some of the smaller, not smaller, those are some of the things that we could do at this moment while we're burning this down over here. Other questions? Oh, one thing I was supposed to say, I'm so sorry. One of my very favorite former students, Christian Holmes, is watching this, and I told him I would name drop him, so hi, Christian.
Okay, oh God, I'm loud. This is partially based off personal experience, but so you bring up a lot of how college admissions uniquely disadvantages minority groups, and I'm curious how things like that aren't, you know, inherited, such as neurodivergence, can also like compound with that.
Totally.
You know, as coming from somebody who is neurodivergent myself, I know the college admissions process was particularly difficult, but I was able to get through it because I had a good support system and a school that looked out for me. But I'd imagine that it'd be a disaster if it wouldn't have been that way.
I agree with you completely. If this process values extroversion, this process values, again, that kind of close one-on-one. If you're neurodivergent, that's a real challenge. But something else, I do a lot of work with Native students, Indigenous students, especially in the summer, and we were doing this like 15 years ago, practice interviews. And I kept saying to these kids, no, you need to look me in the eye, and we're gonna do this. And someone pulled me aside, they're like, culturally, that's a really bad thing. Okay, that really changed how I think about it. This process does not value quietness. It does not value effort that looks like it requires effort. This process does not value a spectrum of things. Here's some, I don't know what we're gonna do with this idea, but one researcher about a year ago reached out to me with this really intriguing idea, and we need to follow up, where she said, I believe that the college admissions process actually values and rewards sociopathy. I really want to chew on that one. I just haven't had the time to go back to it. But no, I agree with you. I think if a student is neurodivergent, if you are not this weird ideal that we developed in the 1950s of what a college student looks like, it's going to be a rough process. It's going to be a really, really rough process from start to finish, and that's not okay. I don't know why we think it is.
Marie, thank you so much for this talk, and I think it's incredibly timely that you're at Dickinson in this moment. For the last 3 years that I've been here, these topics have been hot topics of debate at faculty meetings. And here at Dickinson, all 200 plus of us meet together and talk about these issues.
Thanks.
And I wish I could bring the whole faculty here, because two of the things that have come up again and again and again in our meetings are Dickinson's need to improve its discount rate, meaning that we need to hire, or we need to admit more students that are full fee paying, and that we need to improve our standings in the US News and World Report ranking. Recognizing that obviously we are also responding to systemic challenges and financial trouble, certainly in the pandemic. If I could bring all of my colleagues here as we deliberate these things, particularly moving forward with the strategic planning process, what would you say to us as we specifically consider those two things?
Ooh, I love faculty. Again, 3 generations of faculty in my family. I would say one of the real sicknesses that we have in higher education in this country especially is the chase for prestige, because it is hollow, it is pointless, it is without meaning, and it just makes all of us who work in this space feel good about ourselves. That's really it. I was having a great conversation with Amanda earlier about standardized or rankings. What do rankings mean? And there was a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed maybe a week ago about why rankings matter. So many colleges, especially in admissions, will say ranking doesn't matter. And in our space, our professional space, I believe that we believe that. We really do. But that doesn't mean our boards don't care about rankings, or our presidents, or our faculty. When you drill into the methodology of rankings, it's really bad. And if you're at a place of intellectual discourse and of research and drilling into data, I think one of the best ways that you can fight that rankings argument is to actually examine the methodology of it, because it's garbage. It is garbage. And it changes just enough each year so that the rankings change just enough that U.S. News & World Report can sell a new one. And also the rankings are rigged so that only 3 colleges really will ever be in the top 3. Because when Caltech became #1, sales went down. And the idea was, well, if Hypes, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, if Hypes is not #1, 2, or 3, then it must not be valid because we know they're #1, 2, and 3. I would ask your colleagues and the faculty to be as thoughtful and intellectually engaged and curious and critical of that stupid magazine ranking as they are of literally everything else they do in their job. If they're looking just to be validated, how do you fight that, right? But I would say fight that methodology. Look at that and really drill in and say, what does this mean? What does this actually mean? Nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Might mean something on your job market, which is kind of the crappy thing about academia. Well, that's just truth. How do we deal with discounting on tuition? Oof. That's essentially saying, how do we completely throw out the entire pricing and revenue model of higher education in this country? And we were talking about that as we were walking. Tuition discounting, by the way, anytime you, in the wild, you hear someone say, my child got a merit scholarship, chances are highly likely that what they really received was a tuition discount. Or to frame it in a very consumer term, they got a coupon. You got a coupon. Education's on sale. Because it is much better for an institution to get 85% of that money and let someone feel good about themselves than to get 0% of that money. And when I was in Dallas, we used to lovingly call those scholarships cocktail party scholarships, because those would be like $5,000, $10,000 in the grand scheme of paying for college. Not a ton of money, but it allowed people to brag about that. And if you change that language and be honest about it and say, well, you got a tuition discount. Your degree was on sale today and you happened to walk in at the right time. People don't like that. They don't feel good about that, but boy, people feel good about a scholarship. I don't know how to fight that one. But we'll tell you, if we, again, were just transparent and honest with the language that we use in describing it, that might do something. It's also really sad and embarrassing that in this country, those handful of colleges that have reduced their tuition so that they're not relying on discounting have suffered in the marketplace because there is this ridiculous sense that if something is more expensive, it must be better, which really just means everyone is just taking out a whole bunch of loans to pay for it. And two things, I would really encourage everyone to read the book, The Price We Pay for College by Ron Lieber. It's a book that in theory is for parents. It's about how you pay for college. I actually think, and I keep pushing Ron to think about it this way, I think it's an entirely new paradigm of how to research college, where you say to families, what do you actually value? And by value, I mean, what are you willing to exchange resources for to get in return? What do you value? And what are you willing to pay for it? I love my Mini Cooper, but there's this Maserati that I love more. But my 15-year-old Mini Cooper gets me places just as well as that $120,000 all-matte black Maserati does. And the value I have is getting a place. It's not getting into that car. So I think if we look at things very honestly about that, that'll be a big deal. I think we could do a lot. I don't remember what my second point was going to be there. Sorry.
Do you have time for 2 more questions?
thank you so much for being here. My question is in regard to looking at the admissions process. How have you looked at how to make it more equitable for people of different socioeconomic classes or statuses? Because that also goes hand in hand sometimes with being racially equitable.
Oh, no, I think they're completely intertwined. And when you're a person of color who has high financial need as first gen, that's when the intersectionality of the damages really become clear. I think there's some things that we can do, but it's hard to attack them without attacking that price of attendance, right? But there are some things we can do. Here's some really tiny moves that I think could be really helpful. I think we should, oh gosh, folks in admissions are gonna kill me for this one. I think we should get rid of application fees. Why are you paying between $50 to, in one case, $125 for the privilege of being told no? Those fees are a really big barrier for families. When I was a school counselor, I would tell families at the beginning of the application process, so midway through junior year, that they should budget approximately $300 to $400 per college for just the cost of applying. That might be the fees to apply, that might be a fee to take a test, the fee to send a test. That's a lot of money. It's just a lot. So I think that's one barrier in socioeconomics that could be get rid of that. I think another way to open the door for folks socioeconomically, and I'm gonna applaud Amherst for College for making this announcement 2 days ago, is you kill legacy admissions. Just get rid of it entirely. I say this as someone who benefited very much from legacy admissions. It shouldn't be a thing, and it values whiteness and it values generational wealth. It plays this card that says, well, your family was good, so you must be as well. In the space of higher ed, we think and we say a lot, well, you can't get rid of legacy admissions because those folks won't donate money anymore. But the research has shown that alumni are no more likely to give or less likely to give if their child's in the process. It doesn't actually impact giving. Another point is that perhaps people won't support the college's athletic teams anymore if you don't let your kids in. Frankly, I don't care about that. I just don't care. But I think those two pieces, like removing the fees associated with applying on one end and on the other end, killing legacy admissions entirely. Two ways that we could really open the door socioeconomically.
Question?
Where do you plan on going from here? Like, you've talked about this project and the research.
New Orleans.
But I'm just curious, what are you guys thinking in the future?
It's such a great question. I have to acknowledge, I'm not a good planner. In that I was that person who said, here is the life I've laid out for me, and I will hit this checklist, and then as I just learned that sometimes that checklist doesn't work. And okay, so that's that. Now, accept the organization, Hack the Gates, Accelerated Equity Insights, the new company I founded. Our goals for those things, we really want to hammer on this research to practice partnerships. We really want to expand that reach and partner truly with folks doing good research and doing good policy. I think that's a huge priority for us. Another really big priority for us is how we delve into that policy space more effectively. We've been somewhat effective, but I'm honestly amateur about it. It's kind of flailing along. I think we need to get much, much, much better at that. I think those are two big things. With Accelerated Equity Insights, we're gonna figure out how to use technology to break racist behaviors that people can't identify as racist because they don't see the impact. We're gonna figure out how to use technology to do that, and I think we're getting super close with that. And with Hack the Gates, we're gonna keep chipping away at these papers and getting more people involved and more people engaged with it and just pushing further and further and adding more folks in and getting more going that way. But honestly, some of it is kind of in reaction in some ways, and others is a little more brought out there, but I think what's been exciting is understanding that we have impact and being able to utilize that impact. My big dream is that none of this stuff is required anymore. That, oh my gosh, this process has really changed so much. that I'm not needed. These organizations aren't needed. And in that case, my dream is to move to Santa Fe and blow glass all day long. I'm like one of those examples of like your major doesn't really impact your future that way. My parents were mortified with my majors. Political science and women's studies, double major, and a minor in glass blowing. And they're like, really? It was the best. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join me in thanking Marie Bigham.
Thanks for coming. Enjoy. Good luck with the semester.